DC's annual statewide assessments were released, and for the fourth straight year, the number of students grades 3 through 8 who are proficient in English and math went up, and we have the numbers here on your screen. However, proficiency scores at the high school level dropped, and that's part of the bigger nationwide picture where reading and math scores have been in a steady decline for years. And joining us now to talk about this, sort through this data, is Doug Staiger, professor at Dartmouth University, who has been studying schools and teachers and how they can be the most effective for years. Professor, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And before we get into the DC data that we just shared there specifically, can you talk to us about what you've found in your research nationwide when it comes to student learning?
Yeah, so, what you're seeing, the declines in test scores and achievement has been very broad-based in the U.S. for the last decade. So since 2013, reading scores and math scores, but reading scores particularly, have declined about a grade level. And just to put that in context, that's, we had 2 decades, the 90s through 2013, where test scores increased dramatically nationwide. And so it really has been a turnaround. Other countries are seeing similar declines, particularly in reading. So this is a very broad trend and a real concern.
What do you think is causing this downward trend? I mean, I know a lot of research has focused on the pandemic. That was a huge event. That's kind of been a marker in time for when many students started to face significant disruptions in their learning. I mean, the high school students, as we've seen in the DC assessment, they didn't see gains. What do you think is the cause here? Is it the pandemic even 6 years later?
Yeah, so the pandemic definitely contributed, particularly in math, but the reading trends have just been steadily down since 2013. They really declined quite a bit by 2019, and then it's just continued steady. Math, it's a bit more of a pandemic issue. That a big chunk of the decline was the pandemic, but the reading ones people are very concerned about and think there might be a broader explanation. One thing is it's probably not something U.S. specific because we're seeing this across all the, almost all countries in the world, particularly the higher income countries. We've seen decline in reading achievement. So that has pointed people to think about things rather than just the pandemic, to think about things like the spread of social media and cell phones in schools is one of the leading candidates for explaining this and other trends. A number of trends in young people, mental health, et cetera, have kind of turned down since about 2013.
That is, discouraging to hear. Reading is part of our everyday lives. Basic comprehension is good to keep you safe. We use it every day, right? But, I guess, Professor, then the question is, where are schools falling short in catching this, addressing this? I hate to even say falling short. I guess we should just say, what is the solution? That's the obvious question.
Yeah. So there are 2 things that have kind of been going on, particularly in reading, and I'll focus there. One is, there's been a movement. There had been a lot of alternative ways of teaching reading, and there's been a movement toward phonics-based. It gets called science of reading methods, and so some states like Mississippi have had this dramatic improvement in their reading scores since they went all in on science of reading and phonics. And many states are doing that now and are gradually building that more into their curriculum, particularly in the early grades.
And Professor, not to interrupt you there, but for just super layman's terms, is phonics what I think it is? Can you explain that for us?
It is sounding out words the way, the old school way, rather than the alternative, which had been used and was becoming increasingly popular maybe a decade ago, was this, I think it sometimes gets called whole language, where you are guessing words based on the context or the pictures you see or the other words around it, and that turns out to not be a good way to, not as effective a way to teach reading. And I just want to emphasize the other thing that people are really thinking about here are trying to reverse the cell phone and social media. And so, over half the states now have bell-to-bell cell phone bans as state laws. Most of them started this year, a few in years before. And it's an open question. That a lot of people are studying this, and there's not a consensus yet on whether that will be enough to turn this around.
So true. We've only really seen those relatively for a short amount of time, the impact of phones on our brains, our attention spans, like you're saying. Other strategies besides maybe using just a different curriculum to teach in general. What is maybe another strategy that schools can be using?
So a lot of schools, particularly in response to the pandemic, have been using kind of well-documented interventions that we know work. They're not cheap or easy to do. So the main one would be tutoring and summer school. Tutoring, intensive tutoring, where you're tutors with 1 or 2 students, tutoring them 2 or 3 hours a week for the whole school year. So that's a lot. It can cost maybe $2,000 or $3,000 per student. But that is well documented to have large impacts, meaning like a student will make an extra grade level of academic growth over a year when they're getting tutoring on top of their regular
learning.
Yeah.
I mean, significant outcomes there, and the battle for resources always, and money to do some of those one-on-one interventions there. I know what those numbers look like, Professor. Lastly, if we don't improve learning outcomes for kids, not even nationwide, around the world, like you were saying, in other countries too, what does it mean for our futures if we don't get that right?
We looked at when in the 90s and 2000s, when there was a rapid increase in achievement and scores, we compared states that made rapid achievement to states that didn't. North Carolina, for example, made really big gains over that period. And you can follow the students who were in school there and see what their earnings were when they were in their late 20s. And there are real impacts on earnings, on criminal activity, criminal justice, on teen pregnancy. All kinds of outcomes are improved when test scores go up. And we really think, these aren't, of course, tests aren't the only thing that matters, but they are a good bellwether, a good marker for how these cohorts of students are going to be doing later in life.
A marker of life. Professor Doug Staiger of Dartmouth University, you had so much insight there and expertise. Thank you for taking the time to be with us this afternoon and just walk us through student learning and the state of that right now in the U.S.
Thank you for looking into this.
Sure thing. Professor, take care and stay with us. We'll be right back after this.